Good morning. It's a pleasure to have this speech today. Thank you very much, distinguished guests. I'm pleased to participate in this high-level session. I thank Minister Bartolo for chairing it, my dear friend Everest. I thank Deputy Minister Marina Sereni, all the speakers for their contributions, and Fondazione per le Scienze Religiose, its Secretary Professor Meloni, and the presidency of the Interfaith Forum for organizing this event. Since its first edition in 2014, the Interfaith Forum has raised awareness on the relevance of the religious dimension in the international system and on the intersection between foreign policy and religion, which is the topic of this panel. The forum, by the variety of actors involved and the range of issues discussed, shares with the G20 the inclusive approach needed to foster dialogue and build consensus. The ideas and proposals coming from this platform can stimulate the debate on key social issues, providing the perspective of religious leaders and thinkers. Religious communities, national governments, international organizations are natural allies in facing global challenges such as health, growing inequalities, climate change, education, conflict prevention, and the fight against discrimination. These issues are high on the agenda of the Interfaith Forum, as well as among the priorities of the Italian G20 presidency, an alignment that clearly reflects our common concerns. Italy's model of dialogue between civil authorities and religious communities is part of our constitution and based on an inclusive and open approach. Recognizing the importance of cooperation with communities for all faiths means not only guaranteeing their religious rights, but also recognizing their role within the society. This approach has allowed us to achieve important results in fields like healthcare, assistance to the vulnerable, and other social services. Moreover, as global challenges affect all religions, interfaith dialogue is a powerful tool to identify shared solutions building on the values that different faiths share, such as the dignity of human life. In this regard, the efforts of Pope Francis and the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar that led to the signing of the document on human fraternity in 2019 in Abu Dhabi have set a powerful example for other religious leaders to follow. The active involvement of religious communities and leaders is key in dealing with major social issues at the national and international level. Their outreach capacity and credibility can help spreading awareness, reinforcing public communication, and fostering social cohesion. I will offer 3 examples to highlight the contribution of religious communities to foreign policy. Combating discrimination, fighting extremism, and preventing and resolving conflict. First, combating discrimination. Disinformation and a rhetoric demonizing the other have resulted in several forms of stigmatization, discrimination, and violence, especially during the pandemic. Religious leaders can play an important role in preventing the spread of hate speech and intolerance, especially in time of crisis and conflict areas. Second, fighting extremism. Italy's approach combines security, protection of human rights, and development cooperation to uproot the causes of violent extremism. The situation in Afghanistan shows that the threat of a rising fundamentalism is still concrete and requires a coordinated international response. Italy is engaged in such coordination with all partners, also as G20 presidency, by proposing the G20 as an inclusive platform of dialogue on the Afghan dossier. Our priority must be to continue to ensure assistance to the Afghan people and to preserve the achievements made in the last 20 years, especially in terms of human rights and civil liberties. The social, economic, and political participation of all ethnic, religious, and cultural components of the Afghan society will be crucial for reconciliation and prevention of violent extremism. The contribution of the world's religious leaders in this endeavor will be key. Third, preventing and resolving conflicts. Sustainable peace is achievable only through active mediation and inclusive negotiations. Religious leaders can engage and represent large segments of the society, thus fostering dialogue and reconciliation. I recall the support provided by Comunità di Sant'Egidio to the peace processes in the Central African Republic, Mozambique, and South Sudan, and the mediation efforts of the Episcopal Conference of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Finally, let me mention the Italian NGO Rondine Cittadella della Pace, committed to educating young people in conflict resolution, second-track diplomacy, and human rights. I conclude by reaffirming Italy's commitment to freedom of religion or belief and to the protection of religious minorities in multilateral fora at the United Nations, in Human Rights Council, where this is a priority of our mandate, within the OSCE, the Council of Europe, and the European Union, as well as in bilateral relations with third countries and through development cooperation programs. In 2019, we co-sponsored the resolution of the United Nations General Assembly for the establishment of the International Day commemorating the victims of acts of violence based on religion or belief. In the same year, the Italian Parliament launched a fund for supporting persecuted Christian minorities in crisis regions. Between 2019 and 2021, about 8.4 million euros have been allocated to the fund, and we plan an additional allocation of 4 million euros per year. The fund is financing projects in Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine, and the selection of new initiatives is underway. Interreligious and intercultural dialogue and the fight against all forms of discrimination based on religious or belief should remain part of our commitment to advance a positive global agenda. Our capacity to respond to today's challenges will greatly benefit from recognizing the potential of religions as drivers for peace and human development. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Foreign Minister Di Maio, for these important remarks. And now we open our roundtable. And our first speaker is Freiherr von Böslanger, the Grand Chancellor of the Sovereign Order of Malta.
Thank you. Distinguished forum participants, the Sovereign Order of Malta is currently engaged in some of the main humanitarian crises in the world. For 9 centuries, our modus operandi has been, and indeed is today, characterized by neutrality and impartiality. The programs run to help the disadvantaged, the refugees, religious minorities, the marginalized, and the disabled have no political nor economic agenda. Our mission is to help those in need regardless of their origin, religious belief, or ethnic background. This has allowed the Order of Malta and its relief and volunteer corps to enter and be fully involved in crisis areas. Okay, thank you. Often hostile zones where medical and social programs have been established in partnership with local organizations, many representing different confessions. These activities are supported by our bilateral and diplomatic network. Of the 110 countries with which we enjoy diplomatic relations, 30 are members of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, with whom the Order has long-standing ongoing humanitarian projects. Supporting and advocating for the role of faith-based institutions facilitating interreligious dialogue, particularly in the Middle East, and promoting humanitarian international laws are today among our primary goals. In the wake of the rising xenophobic and populist movements, the Order of Malta has made countless appeals within the international community to uphold human dignity and human rights. We are therefore particularly pleased to participate in this important gathering that seeks to promote social cohesion, address inequalities, and to heal the wounds, both practical and spiritual, which are the legacy of a particularly challenging and uncertain moment in time. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought chaos to the global economies, worsening the living conditions of many communities. The closure of schools has meant that 370 million children worldwide, many of whom are reliant on school meals as primary source of their daily nutrition, have missed on average 40% of school meals. Addressing the social divide the pandemic has further exacerbated is mandatory, and the Order of Malta firmly advocates for an equitable and fair vaccine distribution so that no country is left behind. Religious leaders can play a pivotal role in supporting vaccination campaigns and should be involved alongside governments in the planning and implementation of response and pandemic preparedness policies. The recent dramatic events unfolding in Afghanistan have caused a new refugee crisis. The United Nations has warned that up to 500,000 Afghans could flee the country by the end of the year and has called on neighboring countries to keep their borders open. The Order of Malta firmly believes that only a joint and coordinated response plan on behalf of the EU member states and all nations can address such crises. While it is essential to dovetail migration responses, safeguarding dialogue with the country leaders remains key, however difficult, especially in the quest to protect of women, children, and ethnic minorities. In a country torn by decades of unrest, internal rivalries, and power struggles, we must be aware of the danger that religions be used to exacerbate tensions. On the contrary, religions and religious leaders can play a fundamental role in de-escalating the conflict and ultimately protecting the population. And we have to draw upon this potential also to prevent the misuse of religion's feelings to fuel conflict. It is estimated that by 2050, the global percentage of believers will grow from the current 84 to 87%. Therefore, it is clear that foreign policy and diplomacy are strongly intertwined with religion. Despite this, the role of religion in the foreign affairs of states is still relatively unexplored. This is why, in line with our enduring engagement in multilateral diplomacy, the Sovereign Order of Malta has also recently joined the International Religious Freedom of Belief Alliance, a network of many countries working together to advance freedom of religion or belief around the world. Launched by the US State Department, the alliance seeks to enhance global advocacy to protect the right of freedom of religion or belief and to serve as a platform to better coordinate the efforts of governments, parliamentarians, and civil society. To this end, the Order of Malta has been working on a compact called Religious in Action, drafted with the contribution of Christian and Muslim faith leaders, pointing out basic rules for faith-based actors in humanitarian relief. The document aims at raising awareness on the global geopolitics of religion. Religion is by nature rooted in communities and is an integral part of a person's identity. The key findings of the compact, Religions in Action, stem from the Order of Malta's experience from working in the field. In crisis areas, the degree of success of diplomacy, with its emphasis on dialogue and negotiation, is unmistakably linked to the capacity to engage with religious communities, religious leaders, and include religious infrastructure. This faith-based diplomacy approach promotes interfaith dialogue and recognizes the key role of religious leaders play in conflict resolution and peace building. Humanitarian intervention in conflict, theaters should always acknowledge the importance of adopting a holistic approach whereby the local social and cultural values and beliefs are embedded and molded with the operational schemes. The aim of the compact is therefore to support religious communities and faith-based organizations that dedicate their social and spiritual resources to help mitigate the effects of conflict and enhance the delivery of humanitarian support. The document appeals to the moral values that are universally shared with those with faith and other persons of goodwill, and which are committed to the protection of human life and dignity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My anxiety to be in the roundtable made me skip over the program, and so I apologize, but I give the floor to Evariste Bartolo, Your Excellency. The floor is yours, Maltese Minister for European and Foreign Affairs.
Thank you very much. Thank you, dear friends, for being here. I'll just make some observations, hoping to stimulate a bit of thinking and debating about this. At a first glance, it would seem that religions are the solution and foreign policy is the problem. But that's only a first glance, because both can be parts of the solution and also parts of the problem. All the major religions exhort us to love our neighbors. It's a lot, not respect or tolerate, but love. And neighbors can also be our enemies, our people who do not think like us. Whereas in diplomacy, we tend to talk about like-minded and alliances and blocs. So it seems that they are at tension with each other. What is important, I think, and there is always the risk of this happening, and especially even now when we see it, of how we want to mobilize those who are in favor of democracy and human rights against the other. And there is, I think, a very big threat, risk, that we become, Manichaeist, that we have a Manichaeist foreign policy. Those of us who think that we're on the side, obviously, of good, and we are against those who are evil, those who don't believe in human rights, those who don't believe in democracy. So we want to form a holy alliance against the devils, those who do not believe like us. And obviously we feel we are very superior because we have the right values and we have, we are on the right side of history, we say. I don't want to be obviously cynical or to indulge in moral relativism, but I really see that there is a very big risk that this will complicate even further and will not promote human rights anywhere if we take this full frontal, if we continue, because we've already started doing it. And we see how the Summit of Democracy will evolve, whether it will also be used for this. Because I think, even when I meet my colleagues, for example, the Foreign Affairs Minister of China, we tend, on both sides of the planet, to emphasize what is convenient for us. So we forget that human rights are political, social, and economic rights. So we stress political rights, which are important, obviously, freedom of expression, choosing our government, whereas the Chinese tell us, but we have lifted millions out of poverty. Social and economic rights are more important. I don't think we should fall into this kind of binary thinking. Human rights are political, social, and economic, and it's not an excuse to say, listen, at least in our part of the world, you can be free and hungry. But on the other part of the world, you can be well-fed and unfree. I think we should remember the Charter of the UN Rights, which talks about being free from fear and free from want. But this, I think, should make us humble instead of being self-righteous. I think in diplomacy, when we are self-righteous, we create lots of problems, including intervening in countries like Afghanistan. And I hope that we draw some very important lessons from Afghanistan and from countries like Libya, because we tend first to make a mess, and then years later, we are still faced with that mess and trying to solve it. And going into countries with military interventions and thinking that we are building a nation, we know when you build a nation from the roof down, it collapses. A nation needs to be built from the bottom up. And we know what happened in Afghanistan, the billions of euros spent there, only 2% went to the Afghani people, and all the rest went to the military contractors and to the military industrial complex, which is an important factor to keep in mind today, keeping in mind even the sad fact of last year, in the midst of the pandemic, we found $72 billion to modernize our nuclear arsenals, but we didn't find 50 billion to buy the vaccines for the world. So as a species, we have a very strange sense of priorities. Sadly enough, there were countries struggling to deal with COVID, finding money to clinch new deals on armaments, but not having enough money for their healthcare system and for their vaccines to attack COVID. We've heard a lot of rhetoric of being in one storm. Yes, we are in one storm, facing COVID and the aftermath, but we are all in different boats. Some of our boats are strong and we will survive, but other boats are very fragile and they will have very problem surviving. Enough to say that, talking about Africa, only 3% so far have been vaccinated, whereas we've reached over 60%, and it is becoming more problematic with the third jab that we need, and some other countries haven't even had their first jab first. We cannot give up on this. I believe a lot in pessimismo dell'intelligenza, but ottimismo della volontà. We cannot give up. We cannot afford to give up. That's a luxury we cannot afford. And even then, when we talk about the Mediterranean, recently I was in Bled, and I'll repeat what I proposed over there. We are in a very difficult region, very, very difficult region. Even if we just take climate change, our area is warming up 20% faster than the rest of the world. And we've seen this summer, wildfires, floods. We know that climate change will also mean more displacement, more dislocation, more challenges. At the same time, we need to not only cool down the climate, but also cool down the political and diplomatic climate in the Mediterranean. And we should consider, I know it might sound a crazy suggestion, we should consider setting up a conference on the security and cooperation in the Mediterranean, like we had in Europe nearly 50 years ago. We need the Helsinki spirit. We need the temperature of Finland to lower down a bit the temperature in the Mediterranean. I know that it's not easy. Every single issue is very complicated, whether it's Cyprus, whether it's the Middle East, whether it's Morocco and Algeria, Libya, Tunisia, all these Western Balkans, all these are very complex on their own, let alone trying to bring them together and see what we can do. But they are so interdependent that I think the historical experience that we've had with the Helsinki, the conference on security and cooperation in Europe, did give results. We know that in history, It's like children building sandcastles. We build a nice sandcastle and the sea comes up and takes it away, and then we have to rebuild it again. But that is our fate. So it shouldn't keep us back from doing this. The kind of detente that helped between West and East in the 70s, I think we needed between North and South. And the last point I would really like to make is this, that there is a big risk, talking about Europe now, that we are putting a lot of stress and attention that this is the century of Asia, and that we need to concentrate and focus on the Indo-Pacific. I can tell you, as a Minister for Foreign Affairs in the Foreign Affairs Council, together with Luigi and us down in the South, we find it quite difficult to remind our colleagues that the Mediterranean exists, that it's not only Eastern neighborhood, it's not only Belarus, Ukraine, all those are very important, but the Mediterranean exists. And beyond the Mediterranean, there's Africa, and I fear that we are not taking seriously this challenge. I'm not saying that Asia is not important. I'm not saying that the 21st century is not the century of Asia, but I would say that it's also the century of Africa, and we forget this at our peril. Just one last number. Babies being born today. We live in a world where there will be 500 million middle-aged and old Europeans, but there will be 2.5 billion children and youngsters in Africa. That means a lot. We need to engage with Africa with dignity, without any superiority complex, without any colonial hangovers, as equal partners, to make sure and help them create wealth and jobs there, because otherwise we forget this at our peril. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister, for inspiring and also very frank remarks. And this leads the program to Federica Mogherini, who is a former Madame PESC and today rector of the College of Europe.
Grazie, Filippo. Thank you all for, first of all, organizing this. I think this is amazing. And for me, it's so also emotionally, and not only politically, good and important to be here to discuss this topic that I would say you can take from two angles, and the wise minister just reminded us this. Both the interfaith angle and the foreign policy angle can perceive themselves or can be perceived as part of the solution or part of the problem. To me, the big question is, how can interfaith support foreign policy, and how can foreign policy support interfaith dialogue? And I think this is the question we have today in front of us. And I think there are some very practical things that foreign policy can do to support, I would say, a healthy interfaith practice and dialogue, not only on the top, but also in the grassroots. I think there are very good examples all over the world. I can mention only a couple of things that I happen to witness and support in my years in Brussels as a representative, I'm very proud of. One was the one that Minister Di Maio mentioned, Rondine Cittadella della Pace, was awarded, was indicated by the External Action Service by myself as receiving an award on how to build peace through interfaith dialogue on a grassroots level with young people. And that was, I think, for me at least, a moment of pride, highlighting also the role of the younger generations in preventing and solving conflicts, because we focus so much on radicalization of the younger generations. We don't focus enough on how much of good they can bring in understanding each other and each other priorities. But also a program that was put in place just in this last few years at the European Union level. It's called GERIS, the Global Exchange on Religion in Society, that gathers 500 activists, faith and non-faith based, but working on the role of the religion in different societies, in all different continents, different age groups, different backgrounds. And I was inspired in Indonesia to do so, seeing how the interfaith organizations could work there. And I believe that this is something, for instance, that on an institutional level could be helpful to support. And here I come, if I can react on the minister, not so crazy idea, I believe. This could be something that, for instance, in the Mediterranean could make a lot of sense to invest on. Because if I can jump on what foreign policy can do for a healthy way in which religions can interact with societies, or at least support the role of religions in societies. I think that there is a work that can be done there to increase the knowledge. We always talk about, rightly so, tolerance. It's a word that I personally don't like too much. Respect, which I believe is more realistic than love. Maybe I will play the cynical here, but I think that the European experience in itself shows that loving each other is something that is, let's say, can be an aim for those who believe, but in real life and for sure in real politics, complicated even within one family, one political family, one country, sometimes one government coalition. Imagine across a region that is so complicated. But for sure, respect and shared interests can be very powerful engines for preventing conflicts, solving conflicts, transitioning from a conflict to a non-conflict situation, which is, as the minister mentioned, the weak part of any experience we have lived in the last 20 years. What happens when the conflict is supposed to be over? That is what we didn't really get so far. And I think that in this, the role of interfaith dialogue and religious leaders, but not only leaders, also communities, can be of extreme help in rebuilding the connections, the fabric of communities. And this is really what we sometimes miss in this binary temptation we can have of the good against the evil and vice versa. So I think that if we want to really get to a respectful global environment or regional even environment, I think we have to start from the knowledge angle. And I don't say this because I'm now director of a college, but out of my personal experience, if I can share an anecdote without saying any names. I graduated in Rome, in La Sapienza, prestigious university, excellent professors. In 1998, I took quite many years to graduate because in the meantime I was starting my political activities, but I wanted to write my thesis on political Islam and the role that religion played in the political legitimization in the Arab world. And back in 98, years before 9/11, I found it extremely hard to find any professor in political science recognizing that this was a subject for political science. And I was sent to study in Islamic studies in the Faculty of Philosophy, because that was the place. Again, I think that we need to invest in understanding, before then understanding in knowing what religions imply, which are the basis for beliefs, behaviors, community building, because the knowledge is the basis for respect. Otherwise, respect becomes empty. And if it's empty, can be easily broken, I believe. One last point is that I believe that really the other element that is needed together with knowledge is the knowledge of yourself. I find now that I have to deal with so many young students from more than 50 nationalities that we have at the College of Europe, I find that sometimes a good investment is also an investment in increasing the level of awareness on everybody's identity. I find that the fragility comes when somebody is not so much confident of who he or she is. And here comes the fear of the other, here comes the conflict, here comes the confrontational attitude. And I think that interfaith dialogue and religious organizations and communities can help a lot the foreign policy angle in building communities and societies, including in Europe, maybe especially in Europe, that are self-confident of their own identities enough not to fear the other and the dialogue with the other. And I would not go into any political consideration about that, but I think there is a cultural work to be done there, on young generations in particular. And last but not least, I believe the idea of bringing the Helsinki spirit in the Mediterranean can be extremely helpful, because it's exactly when the complexity and the apparent impossibility to be solved of problems comes so clear on the table, that you cannot afford anymore not to tackle them. And indeed, I share your view. I think that there is a temptation of looking elsewhere. And there might be urgent things to be done elsewhere, but focusing on what is urgent should never distract you from what is important. And the Mediterranean, the relations between Europe and Africa, between the Middle East at large, Africa and Europe, being something that is there and is not there in non-easy ways since thousands of years, cannot be neglected ever. So I believe that starting a process of understanding, knowledge, understanding, and creation of shared interests, which at the end of the day is what worked so well in the European Union, could be something extremely wise to start in the Middle East and in the Mediterranean. I say in the Middle East because I think, for instance, that trying to find ways to increase the basis of common interest, for instance, in a region like the Gulf, could be extremely wise, difficult but wise, and not so difficult, because at the end of the day, the European Union started with something very unpoetic as steel and coal. When you have a shared interest and you also have some common ground on understanding each other and respecting each other on cultural and religious identity, I think that there is a possibility to prevent conflict, or at least to handle difficulties. So I believe that this is not so much a crazy idea. Probably you need crazy ideas to face crazy times. I think this would be extremely worth exploring. I think that one good starting point could be the younger generations. That, for instance, with the Young Leaders Program of the Anna Lindh Foundation, sorry, I'm starting to get into the working attitude here, but I really think that there could be the basis for developing interesting experiences that could lead to pilot projects and then to something probably bigger, because sometimes you start with something small and then you come up with some good practices. Again, I would not define this exercise neither as naive nor cynical. I think that this is exactly what we need to do, not only Europe, but all around the world, because I have the impression that we are indeed in the same storm, not only for the pandemic we have experienced and we probably continue to experience, but also because this comes after 20 years of complex and multifaceted crisis all over the world. And I think that we are at a point where the world needs people of goodwill and people of good knowledge and people of good interests to come together across regions of the world to try and find common grounds and common solutions. And I think that interfaith dialogue and religious communities and organizations and leaders can contribute enormously to guide the foreign policy towards wiser and most constructive and cooperative roads. And also, I believe that foreign policy can be of extremely important support to a healthy interfaith interaction in the world, starting from Europe, where we have a lot of work to do in this respect, I believe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Federica. We as you see, have increasing support for a diplomatic initiative on the CSCM, and which was originated also from religious organizations and the role of the Vatican State, for example, in the 1970s, which was, after all, in the middle of the Cold War. And if at that time it was possible to create a spirit of collaboration, I'm not, I think today would be easier. We have many problems, but we have no Cold War, so perhaps it could be a good occasion. It was mentioned before that this is the center of Asia, so it is my pleasure to give the floor to His Excellency, the Foreign Minister of the Socialist Republic of Sri Lanka, Signor Piris.
Mr. Chairman, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, both the Maltese minister and the rector in their remarks spoke of the interface between religion and foreign policy. There is clearly an interface. The rector, in her concluding remarks, also used the word cynical. There's also a great deal of cynicism and skepticism. That is all too evident. And I think there is a fundamental cause for this. There is the widespread conviction that foreign policy decisions are often made without any regard to ethical or moral factors. It is a question of loyalty to a group to which one happens to belong, and then uncritically, one follows a course of action that is dictated by that group. There is no attempt to search one's own conscience, decide what is wrong, what is right in a particular situation. Now, I think it is worth recalling that there was once upon a time a very powerful movement called the Nonaligned Movement. It still exists, but it has lost a great deal of the vigor and the vitality that it had, the Nonaligned Movement. And a leader of that period from your part of the world certainly played a pioneering role in that. Joseph Broz Tito of Yugoslavia was one of the pillars of the Nonaligned Movement. Then also in this part of the world, we had Archbishop Makarios of Cyprus, who played a leading role, together with world leaders representing different geographical regions and different cultures. Jawaharlal Nehru of India. Then you're going to have your interfaith dialogue next year in Indonesia, President Sukarno of Indonesia. And a leader of my own country, the world's first woman prime minister, the late Sirimavo Bandaranaike, was very much a part of that movement. There were others whose names are well known, Nasser of Egypt, and so on. Now, the whole point of the Nonaligned Movement was look at each foreign policy issue on its merits. You don't come to a priori conclusions. And membership of a group, fidelity to a group should not be regarded as something that overrides and supersedes matters pertaining to one's own conscience. Of course, this movement began and flourished in a certain context, the context of a bipolar world. The rector mentioned the fact that there's no longer any Cold War. I think the chairman said that there's no longer a Cold War. In some ways, it makes life easier. Now, the Nonaligned Movement was developed in the context of a bipolar world. You don't align yourself to this camp or that camp. In one matter, you may agree with this camp, but in another matter, you would completely disagree with that camp and say, no, the other camp is right. So you preserve for yourself the freedom of thought and the freedom of action. Now, today we live in a unipolar world. There is no longer two warring camps, but that does not mean that the ideology underpinning the Nonaligned Movement is entirely irrelevant or obsolete. Not at all. I think if you look at the troubled world in which we live, some elements of that philosophy remain very relevant. And they have a kind of immediacy today, which they probably did not have in the 1960s when the movement had its heyday. So that is a point that I would like to stress. To dispel this mood of skepticism and cynicism, to enshrine a state of things in which foreign policy decisions are made according to moral and ethical values. I think that's an important point. Then reference was made also to the United Nations. The distinguished foreign minister of Malta referred to the fact that the UN Charter speaks of freedom from fear, freedom from want. They are two sides of the same coin. But I think we need to ask ourselves, Mr. Chairman, in a spirit of frankness, of candor, whether the United Nations system is functioning today in the manner that was envisaged by the founding fathers. If you look at the seminal documents of the United Nations system, the Charter of the United Nations, the Declaration of Human Rights, are we really behaving in the manner that was envisioned by these sacrosanct instruments? I don't think one could sincerely answer that question in the affirmative. Today, reference was made to COVID-19 and the responses to that. Look at the Bretton Woods institutions. The Bretton Woods institutions were also fashioned in a certain political context, that is the end of the Second World War. But the world has changed a great deal since then. But those institutions remain largely as they were. Now, the developing world in particular, if the World Bank, for example, were to agree to a policy of debt forgiveness in the excruciatingly difficult circumstances that we have today, then countries that are developing would be able to use their own scarce resources for projects connected with the welfare of their populations. Now, take my own country, Sri Lanka. We normally earn $4.2 billion a year from tourism. That has come almost to a complete stop. Then our trade relations have been affected. Money coming into the Sri Lankan treasury from the efforts of our expatriates working abroad in countries like Italy, that has been affected. So in that situation, if the World Bank were to agree to a policy of debt forgiveness, I think that would greatly accelerate and facilitate the economic development of our countries. Then look at the composition of the Security Council. Does that in any way reflect the reality of the modern world? It does not. It reflects a certain balance of powers that was wholly realistic at the conclusion of the Second World War. But today there are other emerging powers. I won't name countries, but the entire organization needs to be basically overhauled to bring it in line with contemporary realities. The Economic and Social Council needs to be strengthened. Again, there has to be an emphasis on equality, on human dignity. The whole world, not a section of the world. It is not one section, affluent, powerful, dominating the rest of the world and using the United Nations system as an instrument for that domination. That is what creates a certain lack of confidence in the organs and the structures associated with the United Nations system. So I think these are some of the critical issues, imperative issues that we need to address at this time. Just a couple of short points. The other one is that any enlightened foreign policy has to be based upon the concept of mature nationhood, because foreign policy is in a sense an extension of domestic policy. So, the country has to be united in formulating foreign policy. You can't do it in an acrimonious, divided way. Now, many of our countries, certainly my own country, we have different parts of the population speaking different languages, professing different religions. Their cultural backgrounds are completely different. That's a problem. Now, how do you overcome that? I think the key to that is Mr. Chairman, the educational system. The young, impressionable minds. Now, certainly in our part of the world, the Indian subcontinent, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, that part of the world, you have different ethnic communities in schools and universities being taught in completely different compartments. And there's hardly any opportunity for young people to get to know each other, not because there's hostility. There's no hostility at all. It's just that they can't speak to each other. There's no communication possible because of the problem of language. So not only their academic lives, but even their cultural and social lives tend to be entirely compartmentalized. Therefore, language plays a key role in communication, a link language, for example. Then the final point I want to make is this, that we have to look at ethnic or religious political parties. That is also a critical problem with regard to the formulation of foreign policy. In many of our countries, we have political parties that profess overtly to be ethnic in character and complexion. We represent this ethnic group. We represent this religion. I don't think that's a good idea. It does a great deal of damage. In my own country, Muslims, Tamils, members of minority communities have reached the pinnacle of political power and authority as members of the national political parties, right? And that has not inhibited their rise within the democratic system. So there is no need for them to detach themselves from the national polity, to segregate, to compartmentalize the national policy by the formation and the emergence of political groupings that are sectarian. They have a very narrow perspective. And that is hugely detrimental to the solidarity and the unity of our countries. You are contemplating in this G20 Interfaith Forum. So these are some thoughts that I would like to leave with you, not as concluded opinions, but merely as a basis for a very stimulating discussion that we have embarked on under your distinguished chairmanship Mr. Chair, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I do believe that the United Nations has a big role to play, also because we are certainly in an increasingly less Western-centric world, and we need global organizations capable of speaking to different plural cultures. And after 4.5 centuries of Western domination of the rest of the world, today that domination has come to an end. I don't believe we are in a unipolar world. We are in a diffused multipolar world with many emerging powers, and all of them belong to different histories and different cultures and different religions, and therefore a forum like that is the appropriate place. After almost a century, it is now that it has become really up to date as a topic. Last but not least, Monsignor Wachowski, the Undersecretary for Relationship with Faith within the Holy See Secretariat of State.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, I'm pleased to have this opportunity to offer some reflections on the theme of foreign policy and religion, and take this occasion to express my gratitude to the organizers of this G20 Interfaith Forum. When analyzing the situations of tension and conflict that have emerged during recent years, a dangerous temptation arises to place them in the narrative of a clash of civilizations, thus depicting the latter as an inevitable self-fulfilling prophecy. Such as an interpretation also entails a negative spin on the role of religion. On the contrary, at the heart of this dramatic situation of violence, there is a limited vision of the human person, which paves the way to injustice and inequality. True peace, the centerpiece of the common good and the goal of all foreign policy, is the necessary condition for the construction of fraternal societies. Peace is also just and respectful of human dignity, shared by all. As Pope Francis said, the desire for peace can never be satisfied by military means alone. Peace must be built on justice, social economic development, freedom, respect for fundamental human rights, the participation of all in public affairs, and the building of trust between peoples. Nevertheless, although endowed with the freedom to choose peace over violence and fear, humans throughout history have often succumbed to the temptation of power and the search for a world order imposed by the force of arms, a situation that Pope Francis described as a Third World War fault piecemeal. In such a spurious quest, religion and religious have often been exploited as an instrument and as a justification for war. Sadly, this had undermined the possibility of lasting peace in the past and continues to be the tragedy of our current world. Therefore, in our globalized world, it is more important than ever to stress the value of dialogue at all levels, diplomatic, intercultural, and also among religious traditions. Indeed, religion and diplomacy can complement and reinforce one another with faith-based informal diplomacy, as well as the formal diplomacy of states and multilateral bodies working toward the same ends, but through different means. Strengthening this relationship makes a strong positive contribution to the overall efforts to achieve meaningful peace. After this brief introduction, please allow me to make just 3 points. The Holy See strives urgently to promote religious dialogue and fundamental human rights, especially religious freedom, throughout its diplomatic activity at the bilateral and multilateral levels. Pope Francis has proven through symbolic actions toward interreligious dialogue and his numerous apostolic journeys, and particularly during his recent visit in Iraq, that meeting one another in fraternal friendship is a powerful sign, one that shows the harmony which religions can build together, based on personal relations and on the goodwill of those responsible. In his speech at the Global Conference of Human Fraternity held in Abu Dhabi, Pope Francis made it clear that there is no alternative. Either we will build the future together, or there will be no future. Religions, in particular, cannot renounce the urgent task of building bridges between peoples and cultures. The time has come when the religious should more actively exert themselves with courage and audacity, and without pretense, to help human family deepen the capacity for reconciliation, the vision of hope, and the concrete paths of peace. Religions have an indispensable part in building a culture of encounter and peace based on mutual understanding in the search of the common good. For the Catholic Church, peace building through active no violence is the natural and necessary complement of its continuing efforts to limit the use of force by invoking moral norms. In many parts of the world, beginning with the Middle East, this approach is needed to foster fully reconciled society and to renew peaceful civil coexistence. Second point, in the pursuit of the goal to inspire and support every initiative that seeks to bring peace to the world, religious leaders have a central role to play. It is crucial that civil authorities not only recognize this role, but also engage and facilitate cooperation and dialogue with religious leaders. We know all too well the unfortunate, even fatal consequences that occur when foreign policy decisions ignore or outright deny the significant place of religion in addressing the challenges that governments must confront. And this not only applies to the perennial question of conflicts, including conflict prevention and post-conflict remedies, but also to the other global issues, such as education, disarmament, the care for creation, migration, and human rights. The third point, today, in spite of the presence of many conflicts in the world, we have grown accustomed, especially in the Western world, to taking peace for granted. In a sense, we seem to have lost a sense of the fear of war. On the contrary, we have developed the thinking that war per se is not such a dramatic and terrible event. A dramatic example of this reality is given by the pervasive violence represented in war video games. Many children play these violent war games while killing and destroying of human lives is depicted as a hobby or as a leisure activity. Sadly, in these games, the more you kill and the more havoc you wreak, more you are rewarded. I believe it is important to recognize that such behavior is unacceptable. We need to insist on changing this mentality because it trivializes the suffering of others and does not contribute to the spread of the foundational values such as compassion, dialogue, and cooperation. In conclusion, just like the old saying that Rome was not built in a day, building peace is an ongoing and dynamic process, even once it seems to have been achieved, and we cannot take it for granted. Indeed, peace is the only true direction of human progress. As Pope Francis recalled, peace is a gift, a challenge, and commitment. It's a gift because it flows from the very heart of a God. It's a challenge because it should never be taken for granted. It must constantly be sought. It is a commitment because it demands passionate effort on the part of all people of goodwill to seek and strive for peace. In this regard, religions and the faithful in particular must prove themselves to be steadfast. With this in mind, I would like to conclude by stressing the responsibility of religious leaders, especially in an ever more interconnected world and in the era of social media, to help counter the spread of hatred and violence in the name of religion, and to promote more inclusive and peaceful societies. The more religion is manipulated to justify acts of terror and violence, the more religious leaders must be engaged in the overall efforts to uphold and live in a world, in action, to a true face of religion, which is one of authentic peace and harmony among all peoples. In this way, religion can also be instrumental in preventing conflicts. As we well know, in order for religious leaders to fulfill this mission, national authorities must continue to recognize and ensure religious freedom as an inalienable fundamental human right, indispensable for all other human rights. Before concluding, I would like just to add on a personal, one personal remarks. I found it interesting that two of distinguished speakers here speak about the spirit of Helsinki. I served in our permanent mission in Vienna for some years after I followed the OSCE as a desk officer. So I found it interesting that this idea is proposed for the Mediterranean. I think that what is important for the beginning of this eventual process is that we look at the beginning of the process, at the real spirit of the Helsinki, at the first conference, when the principles of Helsinki was agreed. Because if we look at the point where we are today, with all commitments that are almost difficult or impossible to read out, it will be difficult for the countries to start with this point. But if we start from the beginning, from this fundamental principles of Helsinki, I think it could be success. And I wish it will be so. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Monsignor Wachowski, for your very interesting remarks. And we are in perfect timing. So we conclude the roundtable with the final remarks by the Right Honorable Marina Sereni, who is a Deputy Foreign Minister and of a ministry aptly called Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, which is the Italian one. So please, you have the floor.
Thank
Marina.
you, Filippo. Thank you. Just a few words. I would like, first of all, to warmly thank our distinguished panelists for their insightful remarks on such a critical topic as the relation between foreign policy and religion. We have listened to the view of the Sovereign Order of Malta in this respect and to the direct experience of Sri Lanka. We have listened to the inspiring words of Rector Mogherini about the crucial role of knowledge as basis of a true respect among cultures and religions. We have heard the very deep, profound speech of Undersecretary Wachowski about the formal and informal diplomacy and the strong message that we received by the Pope Francis in these days. I have very much appreciated the reference Minister Bartolo has made to Malta's commitment to relaunch dialogue and cooperation in the Mediterranean through new initiatives and through a new process, a new Helsinki process. This is an objective that Italy not only shares, but also actively supports. In this spirit, we have contributed to the launching of the new agenda for the Mediterranean of the European Union by drawing our partners' attention to the need to cooperatively manage the Mediterranean common goods our region is endowed with. Among this set of tangible and intangible resources, intercultural and interreligious dialogue has the potential to trigger positive spillovers on wider political and economic cooperation, as well as on our common fight against terrorism and violent extremism. With no intention to be exhaustive, this is not a debate that could be concluded. I would like to point out three main lessons that I think we can draw from today's debate and we all agree on. First, politics and religion cannot afford ignoring each other. Was unfortunately the case in too many circumstances in the past. Mutual ignorance may lead to missed opportunities at best, to serious tensions at worst. Second, dialogue and cooperation between civil and religious players should be conducted on a basis of mutual trust, respect, non-interference. Attempts at instrumentalize the matter would jeopardize efforts to pursue the common good and only serve parochial and short-period interests. Finally, yet importantly, it has now become clear that civil and religious actors share within their distinct domains a common responsibility to advance a positive agenda based on shared values such as human development, dignity, mutual interest in understanding, and peaceful cooperation. And I really I agree very much to the speech of Minister Bartolo about human rights. We cannot divide political, social, and economic human rights. As Minister Di Maio has stressed in his remarks, Italy is willing to capitalize on the contribution of religious leaders and communities to the advancement of the global agenda by exploring and expanding synergies within the priorities of our G20 presidency and beyond. Let me conclude really by seizing this opportunity to thank and congratulate the Fondazione per le Scienze Religiose Giovanni XXIII and the presidency of the IF20 for the remarkable work they have done in paving the way to this summit. I wholeheartedly encourage them and all potential partners and stakeholders to intensify their efforts to strengthen the partnership between civil and religious players. This will help all of us to better respond to global challenges while always maintaining people at the heart of our common action. Thank you very much and welcome to Bologna.
Thank you, Marina, and everybody for this very, very interesting roundtable about a very crucial topic, the relationship between foreign policy and between religion and foreign policy. Let me just say that the founder of the Fondazione, Don Giuseppe Tossetti, would be in a perfect spirit and mood today because his intuition in the 1950s would have been a crazy dream, but now it is taking place and shape in occasions such as this. And so thank you very much and keep enjoying the wonderful G20 initiatives over the next few days.